Okay, we're going to go ahead and get started. We're going to have a lot more people filtering in, I'm sure, but I'm going to go ahead and proceed with the introduction. I want to thank everybody for joining us for this week's edition of This Is CDR, a weekly webinar series that OpenAir hosts with CDR practitioners, entrepreneurs, and experts all over the world. I'm Chris Neidl. I'm a New Yorker based in Costa Rica, and I'm one of the co-founders of the OpenAir Collective. So I'm excited to be your co-moderator today. What I want to do is just give you a little bit of background quickly on the series and on OpenAir, and then I'm going to hand over to my co-host, Megha Raghavan, who will introduce our speakers, and we'll go from there. For those of you who are not familiar, we're really excited, that we see a large repeat audience for this series. But for those of you who don't know, This Is CDR, as I just said, is a weekly series that we do to try to really give our audience a sense of how broad and diverse and rapidly growing the carbon dioxide removal world is. So every week, again, we have folks who join us representing companies and research institutions to talk about different forms of CDR. OpenAir, which puts on the webinar every week, is a distributed volunteer network that's all volunteer run, and it's focused on the advancement of carbon dioxide removal. And so you can join us. I know Megha will put a link in. Everybody is welcome. We exist on Discord, which is sort of a Slack-like platform. And our members are active both in the sort of citizen science space, doing collaborative research in CDR. And then we also have a very robust and active advocacy membership that are working on policies and ways to advance carbon dioxide removal in the real world through activism. And for those of you who are new to carbon dioxide removal, we will post a couple of resources that we think are helpful for learners of all levels. One is the Carbon Dioxide Removal Primer, which is essentially a textbook that you can read free online that was produced by many of the leading thinkers and practitioners in CDR globally last year. One thing we like to really stress as advocates for carbon dioxide removal, which describes activities that pull carbon that's already in the air and other greenhouse gases and store them permanently, whether in geology and terrestrial materials or even in built materials, like we'll talk about today, is that carbon dioxide removal is no substitute whatsoever for rapidly and immediately reducing and eliminating emissions or making investments in resilience and adaptation. Those things have to also happen, and we have to prioritize those. But the reality is there's a broad scientific consensus right now that those are no longer enough to keep us within a safe threshold of temperature change. We also now have to remove gigatons, that's billions of tons of carbon dioxide from the atmosphere using a variety of different methods. So this is a third necessary front in our response to the climate emergency. Today, extremely excited. This is a project that is near and dear to my heart, Urban Sequoia, a project of Skidmore, Owings Merrill. I was lucky to serve as a sort of a minor advisor to this project and saw it unfold. And to me, it's just incredibly imaginative and really exciting for its real world potential. What I'm going to do right now is we'll get right into the presentation. We're lucky to have both Yasemin Kologlu and Aaron Zeligs from Skidmore, Owings and Merrill present today. And for that, I'm going to pass it over to my co-host, Megha Raghavan, to do introductions.
Hey everyone, I'm Megha. I'm an OpenAir member based in London, but working on policy opportunities in California, where I'm from. So quickly, the format that we'll have today is a short presentation followed by a few prepared questions that were sourced from our OpenAir community, and then we'll do moderated audience Q&A. So please type any questions you have for the presenters into Zoom's Q&A box as we go along. Note that that's separate from the chat function, so make sure you just find the right box to help us organize all the questions. The event is being recorded, and we will send the video link out to everyone who registered, and we'll also post it to OpenAir's website and to our YouTube channel, and we'll also be live tweeting today's event. So we'll put our Twitter link in the chat. I think I've already put it in, and the hashtag, if you tweet and want to follow along, will be hashtag This Is CDR. This week, we are very happy to welcome Yasemin Kologlu and Aaron Zeligs, the Design Director and Design Associate for Skidmore, Owings and Merrill's New York office. Yasemin and Aaron will present Urban Sequoia, a brilliant proposal to use architecture, design, and planning to reinvent the urban built environment into a network for absorbing carbon. Yasemin Kologlu is a design director in SOM's New York office. She's a strong advocate for equality, diversity, and innovation in the design industry. Her portfolio includes innovative headquarters, near zero energy offices, and net zero carbon residential and mixed-use developments. She's a founder and firm-wide leader of SOM's Climate Action Group, which promotes stronger sustainable practices in the built environment. She is a part of the Carbon Leadership Forum in New York, Steering Committee, AIA New York's Committee on the Environment, and the Building Energy Exchange Architecture Advisory Council, and has contributed to multiple industry advisory groups to help shape New York City and state policies on carbon and energy. Aaron Zeligs is a design associate in SOM's New York office. In his work, he seeks to negotiate the contact between architecture and engineering with a focus on complex mixed-use tall buildings. Aaron leverages a unique design perspective as a prior aerospace engineer into creating architecture, sustainable technology, and performance-oriented design. Aaron holds a BS in mechanical engineering from the US Air Force Academy and a master's in architecture from the University of California, Los Angeles. Aaron and Yasemin, over to you.
Hi, thank you very much. Okay. Thank you for that great introduction, actually. Okay, let's get started. So, as Chris mentioned, I think we were fortunate to actually have this this project where Urban Sequoia, where we envisioned how a built environment can actually start absorbing carbon rather than trying to reduce carbon emissions, but actually go to an absorbing position. And we also were fortunate to have Chris as part of our collaboration, as part of our advisors. And you'll see that many of the things that you're going to see today are looking at some of the technologies that many of you probably are looking at as part of the Open Air Collective too. So to start with, I think we all know that we have a challenge. Climate change is here, and unless we can actively make a change, it's not going to go away. So our ecosystem is already out of balance. And the built environment has a big role to play in this. And to set the tone a little bit is, I think, as if we keep on going as we do, business as usual, we're about to hit 3 degrees or so by the end of the century. And yet our target should be around 1.5 degrees. So we all have a role to play as individuals, as professionals, and as also as a society in this as well. And interestingly, I think, when we look at the population increase as well as the carbon increase, there's almost a direct correlation. And population is not expected to slow down anytime soon. And we're expected to be 2.1 billion by 2050. That means that we need to decouple the carbon emission from the population growth in order to have an impactful change here. And as part of this growth, urban areas have a big role to play, of course, and we do know the benefits of compact environments, and how resilient they can be, etc. And it's assumed that with this type of population growth, the demand in the cities will grow also. We are expected to have 2 times the built area by 2060, which is a huge growth if you think about it. And with this equation, the cities around the world account for about 70% of carbon emissions globally. And this is not because cities are worse than other environments. I think cities just are more compact and the density is so much higher that their emissions are actually higher than other environments. But this shows the importance of how urban environments can become a key player. And rather than being part of the problem, can we be part of the solution? And these are some of the provocations that we started with when we first launched this project. And at the moment, many architects, many engineers in the built environment are looking at net zero architecture. And even this is a challenge for some projects. So, we are asking ourselves, is net zero architecture good enough? Or can we do better? How do we go beyond net zero and actually be carbon positive? So as part of this, we started thinking to ourselves, okay, well, a tree can make a difference, but a forest makes a bigger difference. So can we imagine a world where each building can start acting more like a tree? And if there's potential in this, what are some of the technologies, some of the ideas we can explore here and to realize it? So there was born the idea of a building typology or a building prototype, let's say, that can absorb carbon from the atmosphere. And this is what we called Urban Sequoia, by exploring some of these newer or leveraging technologies that exist outside of our industry. So for this, we looked at existing technologies and emerging solutions that are either here, but exist in other industries, or they're in the making or in development, and maybe they have not been yet fully adopted by building systems or built environments. And as we did the study, we were not, even though the prototype that we're going to show you today shows a high-rise building, we actually are not thinking that this effort was not specific to solve a high-rise issue. This was actually looking at an urban environment and the different typologies that exist in this environment and explore strategies that might apply to all. But the prototype that we're going to show you today is a high-rise, just because high-rise is the hardest one to get the net zero to begin with. And we wanted to set ourselves a good challenge of how do we get beyond that net zero? And we wanted to start with a high-rise for that reason. So, but many of the systems technologies we're looking at today can apply to others, and we do recognize that all different scales and sizes will have to work together in a built environment as a network to create an impactful change. And as part of this, so there's the Urban Sequoia idea born, and as part of this exercise, we're looking at exploring maybe 3 different categories of technologies and innovation solutions. Biomaterials. So these are materials that use natural processes, such as biobrick, and actually produce building materials and maybe an alternative to timber or bamboo, which are often referred to as net zero or net positive materials. The second one is nature-based solutions. Can we look at, for example, microalgae and a production of it on site to actually use it as a biomass, a biofuel? And then the third one is technological advancements, and such as the direct air capture technologies here. Can we actually imagine a world where direct air capture becomes adopted in the built environment rather than exist in a farm format, as we often refer to it? And with this type of ideas, I think we can probably safely say that today, with structural optimization, architectural optimization, careful selection of materials, we probably end up here about 60% reduction. To go that further, 35%, we are looking at biomaterials. And actually, we're thinking that that's day one. If you look at the lifespan of a building, if the building continues to sequester carbon, we can be at a carbon negative, actually, and about 3.5 times the emission of a typical building. This is extremely important. So rather than thinking of building as emitters through its lifespan of 50, 60 years, can we see the building as a carbon absorber, carbon sequestering tool for the 50, 60 years? And to do this, many of the systems we look at are going to have to come together. So there's not one solution here, but many of these ideas are going to come together. And Aaron, you can walk us through maybe a bit more detail here.
Okay, great. Thank you, Yasemin, and thank you, everybody. We're really excited to be going through this today. So first, urban sequoias can collectively contribute to the regeneration of our growing cities. And we can do that by considering all the different layers that we can bring together and integrate through the building's form, creating simple, repetitive structural modules, integrating biomaterials, as we've been talking about, and how else can we take other technologies such as algae and direct air capture and work together to integrate those ideas into a scalable net negative architecture that can then transform the rest of the urban ecosystem. And so in the scenario where our buildings could have 85% prefabricated and modular elements, we could achieve a better efficiency, reduce waste, and less movement of people and goods, which will mean less pollution to our cities. What this does essentially is reduce 30% of carbon from our high-rise buildings, simply by modularity and prefabrication that are considered from the beginning. If we add to this integrated systems that are both passive and active, tall buildings of essentially 60 stories could save almost 60% of their carbon. The materials we choose for our buildings have an absolutely important impact on the environment. And this is where we must balance nature, natural resources, technology, and the built environment. When we leverage emerging technologies capable of capturing carbon from our atmosphere, we can find a balance between human technology and that natural sequestration process. So with the advancements in material science, these natural-based sources can offer low carbon and scalable alternatives to traditional construction methods. In this situation, biomaterials, which have the capacity to actively absorb carbon. These biobricks can be made from locally sourced aggregate using low-tech construction methods, bringing a sense of equitability and access to these new types of technologies. And over the last 100 years, we've been predominantly using concrete and steel to build our cities. By simply opting for low carbon materials and considering things such as timber or even these emerging carbon sinking materials such as biobrick, bioplastics, and biocrete, we can significantly reduce the building's carbon emissions and impact on the city. Additionally, these biomaterials can be used and considered in a modular way, beginning to start to push the boundaries between structural efficiency and carbon sequestration. Algae, on the other hand, can also be used to create an active carbon sink. Now our buildings can absorb carbon rather than emitting it, just like the initial sequoia tree. So when coupled with technological advancements, these solutions essentially deliver carbon negative buildings at scale. Algae can be integrated and designed into a building's enclosures by harnessing the power of the sun and then leveraging the natural occurring processes of photosynthesis. Algae, water, and air can be combined in tubes exposed to the sunlight and then naturally capture carbon, used as a source for clean energy. These algae systems can be developed and designed into unitized panels to simply integrate into a building's enclosure and thus producing clean fuel for the building itself and further leveraging this energy source at the urban scale. And as an example, from our partners at Arup in Hamburg, Germany, who has worked very closely with local architects on the solar leaf building, which already performs this process of algae and energy sequestration today. And in this example, by producing biomass, algae can be used as a clean fuel source at the urban scale for power, food, fuel, heat, and manufacturing. And then additionally, with the recent and emerging technological advancements of carbon capture and carbon storage, we can dramatically accelerate the decarbonization of the building industry. Well, how does this work? The air flows into a device with a specialized filter. This filter captures the CO2, and when saturated, carbon is then collected into a bottle. We can harness a building's central core and utilize concepts such as stack effect, where we can enable airflow to move up through the building in a low energy situation and essentially take the direct air capture and integrate it into zero energy consumption.
And interestingly here is some of us, it's similar. There's a lot of parallels between, for example, photovoltaics and what's happening with direct capture technologies. When PVs first came out, you probably remember that they used to exist like the left side image. The cost was quite high. It existed in a farm format. So in open fields, usually there was PV farms, and we still have some. And the cost was quite high. And over 15 years, we've seen a dramatic decrease, about 90% of cost decrease in PV's implementation. And the implementation side, it's increased incredibly well in many locations around the world. And many of our buildings and built environments today have incorporated PV panels, either on the facades or roofs as part of building integrated systems. So can we imagine a similar scenario where a CDR can also be adopted? So can we go from the DAC farms that you see on the left side and actually go to building integrated systems that you might see on the right side? And what this might do is also broad implementation, cost reduction, and probably policies that came along with the PVs back in the day. Similar ideas also we are seeing maybe percolating as we speak today. And interestingly, some of you might have seen this at COP26 conference. Our Secretary of Energy talked about what are some of the technologies that we should be looking forward to in order to capture carbon from the atmosphere. And direct air capture technology was singled out as one of the big potential. And she also highlighted how the energy costs for the government was going to go down, and there were significant investment and efforts that were being put towards this. So looking quite optimistic for the future of a system like this, for example. And to bring everything together, I think in this prototype building, what we're suggesting is that can we look at this type of biomaterials solutions, nature-based solutions such as microalgae, and direct air capture technology, such as what we just talked about, Can we bring them together to actually create a breathing building, a carbon absorbing building as a prototype? And as Aaron described, this building will not only exist alone in its context, but it needs to be part of a network of buildings. So a building alone can sequester about 300% more carbon than it would have emitted. But if we can connect it to a network of buildings in our districts, in our cities, it can actually be even more effective. And what this could do is some of the harnessed materials, such as carbon or microalgae, could be used in other industries, such as building industry. It could be used in food industry as carbonation tools or as bioprotein. It could be used in agriculture as fertilizers. And it could offer an alternative to biomass and biofuel and freight and energy industries also. And can we imagine a network of these that connect together that even is smarter than it would have been as a single building, standalone building? And as we think about the spaces between the buildings too, we also looked at what could it mean in terms of using these spaces also as carbon absorbing tools. Can we actually replace some of the hard surfaces with materials like biobricks? So can we create biopavers? Can we use actually CO2 storing tarmac? Can we use some bioplastics? Can we use the CDRs also in the scale as well? And really optimize and maximize the potential of the natural sequestration with greenery as well. And what this could mean is that with the integration of greenery, maybe we can achieve about 120% carbon reduction. With intensive planting in parks, maybe about 200%, again, over 60 years. And then integrated urban blocks, we might be able to achieve another 110%. And this is approximately 1,500 tons of CO2 per year for a kilometer square of a city. And let's imagine for a second, in New York, what could this mean? Could we create a network of these, both carbon sequestering, maybe algae producing, as well as biobrick materials? And if we could create it in a city like dense city like New York, could we also do it in other places? Could we create a series of urban sequoia forests around the world in our cities? Can each city start sequestering carbon, absorbing carbon from the atmosphere rather than emitting? And what this could mean is that we could save about 1.6 billion tons of carbon every year from the atmosphere. And this is huge it's not the only solution, but it is huge in our carbon equation. And yes, we do know that this has opportunities and challenges, but if we dream about it for a second, actually the built environment can be part of the solution and not part of the problem. And lastly, before we jump, we have a short video that I would like to share, but I also want to thank our collaborators here. Chris already mentioned that Open Air was actually a collaborator. Chris helped us with some of the research in this process. And also we had Architecture 2030, Ed Mazria, Vincent Martinez, and Aaron McDade. And from University of Colorado Boulder, we had Will Strubar, whose lab basically is researching the biobrick and similar materials. And we had Pamela Conrad from CMG Architects, a landscape architect, basically, who helped us to optimize the carbon sequestration potential of natural landscapes also. And I'm going to do a new share, stop this and do a new share briefly so I can show you the video. Just bear with me for a second. All right, so hopefully this is going to work now. All right, hopefully you'll hear the sound. Right, and I'll stop there. So I think our provocation is that, rather than trying to go to zero, what can we do? How can we adjust the built environment and use some of these emerging technologies to actually go one step beyond? Can we be part of the solution? And hopefully this gives you a glimpse of the things that we've been thinking through this process together with our interdisciplinary team at SOM that involved architects, planners, engineers, sustainability specialists, and also our external advisors, such as individuals like Chris Neidl here. Thank you for your time.
Thank you. Fantastic. Really, really appreciate that. That was an excellent overview. So we do have quite a few questions from our community, as always, and some really, really good and varied ones. And we'll get to those in just a moment with Megha. But I did want to just start with maybe a couple of prepared questions. And one, we like to kind of demystify how these projects sort of happen, and that they're ultimately driven by people with motivations and with backgrounds. And that's a key part of the story here. So I wonder if both of you could just quickly give us a little bit of background on your own sort of intellectual journey as, successful architects working in, one of the largest architecture firms in the world, but landing in this particular area of practice. And Yasemin, I wonder if we could start with you, if you could give us a little bit of background, and then Aaron.
Right. I think it's a great question, actually. And sometimes our careers take expected and unexpected turns in a way. And I'm a design principal at SOM, so I'm involved with a lot of conception and building of different types of projects, and mostly large scale and mostly mixed use or residential and offices as well. But at the same time, I think we do recognize the importance of being a citizen architect, right? So, which means that we need to be conscious about what's happening in our society. We need to be conscious about what's happening in our planet. So the well-being of planet and well-being of people. And I think as part of that, we do ask ourselves, how is our ecosystem doing right now, both in terms of societal events, but also in terms of planet. And we recognize that climate is a key part of this equation. It also ties into everything else. Well-being of people are dependent on the well-being of planet. So as a result, in addition to our maybe day-to-day job, we also try to do research projects like what we showed you today to advance some of these ideas and actually prepare them for market too. So learnings of this now it starts applying to some of the buildings, or they also open up collaboration avenues that we wouldn't have otherwise. So interdisciplinary collaboration, as well as collaboration between industries, are quite critical. So quite excited for that reason. And hopefully this gives you an idea about how building professionals like ourselves could start also making a difference in different ways.
Great. And Aaron, I'm fascinated by your bio, which has so many interesting points in it. And just maybe you could give us a little bit of what got you here working on carbon negative architecture.
Yeah, well, thanks, Chris. It's been a really exciting journey for me. And I think, starting as an engineer, I've always been fascinated by, material science and the environmental world and the kind of unseen forces that actually will help shape our society and our buildings. And as I transitioned from pure engineering into architecture, I found it's very fascinating to consider the environment and to consider all of the different avenues that are pushing and forcing a building to kind of come together the way it is created into an actual experience. And that experience can be driven through the dialogue of sustainability, performance, and well-being. And so naturally, that's kind of led to the creation of towers. And so I've specialized over the past several years on tall buildings. And so bringing together engineering, architecture, and this multidisciplinary approach that Yasemin mentions is really critical when the architecture and the scale of the architecture gets so large. And so often what we find at SOM is that we're trying to lead the project through the environmental diagram. And how does the idea actually have a genesis around environmental ideas, and how do those ideas create that experience of the architecture?
Great. And so just, one of the things that I think is really interesting about carbon dioxide removal, particularly at this early stage, is that it's so focused on the magnitude of the problem. And so there's this idea of we've got so much carbon in the air, and then we've got these technologies or solutions that we're going to have to pull it out of the air. And often what gets lost, I think, at that level is just to get us there is going to require enormous acts of creativity and imagination applied to the real world. And what we see at Open Air is there's so many different people who come in from different backgrounds who are sort of thinking about this, and it's really exciting. But I've always thought of architecture is really a potentially really significant sort of area of practice that can really move the ball forward. And I think your project demonstrated that. Could you tell us a little bit about your own, what you're seeing? I get part of it, the response to your project, but is carbon dioxide removal beginning to get sort of absorbed into the architectural imagination? Are you seeing this sort of taking shape as it is in other domains?
Yeah, and a great question, Chris. And I think historically, let's say in the US side, we have seen more of a focus on energy and not as much on carbon, right? I think for many years, many professionals in the built environment have focused on energy reduction, renewable energies versus maybe dirtier source of energy. However, I think we're seeing the shift towards carbon, and that comes with deeper understanding of what energy really means and what different types of energy sources also mean too. And I mean, you know this, and actually this is not a new concept in some of the European countries, and I can see that from some of those European countries we have attendees today. Some of those countries already have taken the EU directives in the carbon direction and not necessarily energy. And we're seeing more of a focus shift on carbon. And this goes into, for example, California has some laws. In New York, we have some laws. And so policy is shifting in that direction. And as a result, the market is also shifting too. The market is pushing in that direction, but also policy is pulling in that direction too. So we're seeing, LECLA, that I know that you were influential in that, is pushing, for example, for embodied carbon. And we have local law 97 that is actually looking at operational carbon, actual emissions, carbon emissions. So for sure, the direction has shifted and continues to shift. And I think it's a big wave, I call it the big carbon wave. And this wave is big, and you can only see the tip of it right now, but it keeps on unfolding in the sea. It's coming.
Well said, Yasemin. And I think
go ahead, Aaron.
To pile on, I mean, I think it's a really special time, both for engineering professions, master planners, cities, and now architects. And the reason I say that is because we've had over the past 10 years this maturation of technology that's been kind of in specific silos, and specific groups of people have been working on strategies to actually sequester carbon from the atmosphere. And now, as that technology starts to become a bit more feasible, it's the architects and the urbanists that have to take these ideas and integrate them into something that we can actually live in, and something that we can actually use, and something that we can actually occupy. And so typically it's the role of the architect to be that integrator, to take all of these different ideas and synergize those into an actual concept, and then to take that concept forward and eventually get it built. And so I find this just a fantastic opportunity where all of these different layers and this interdisciplinary approach the world has taken towards carbon is now at that critical moment where we can begin to actually implement some of this, and that will, the integration of that can actually change the way we experience our buildings and our cities.
I love that. That's great, Aaron. Totally agree. This is something that has to be occupied. But just my last question before I hand it over to Megha is, obviously you've presented a really holistic vision here that's integrated, and that's one of the really impressive aspects, I think, of the project. But speaking to you since the project's been launched, I know that there's ways of looking at elements of this being potentially realized more sooner in a more sort of piecemeal way. So I'm wondering, can you tell us a little bit about how this vision sort of is starting to maybe intersect with the real world in practice, or what you see sort of happening first as a result of this project?
I can maybe start with that. And I mean, as with any new idea, I think this is going to be an incremental implementation process. And we're seeing some of these happen. And I don't want to make it sound like SOM is doing all of these things. I think there's so many people doing all of these things. We're just kind of maybe the faces of it in today's conversation. For example, we are actually working with University of Colorado in the development of BioBrick and with Prometheus Materials. So this type of innovative materials take the pressure off of timber and bamboo, and we're actively looking at material properties and how the material could develop to be a net zero, net positive material in a way. So that's for example, on the material side, but many others are also looking at bioplastics, hempcrete, and others that might offer alternatives for some building components. And I mean, that CDR is gaining a lot of momentum, and there's a couple of examples of direct air capture units installed in New York City skyline, actually, even though it's not visible. And companies like there are a couple of startups who have who are leading the market, and they're probably no longer considered startups anymore. But we're seeing that these are being installed in different shapes and forms. There's not one answer to this, but I think the technology is already here, and we are seeing this incremental implementation of them in different parts. And some of our projects are also looking at similar technologies too.
Yep. And, the concept of carbon in our buildings has been something that's been within our discussion internally at SOM, and as well as in other architecture firms for many years now. And so what we've essentially realized in the past year or two is that net zero and the way we've been considering our carbon reduction is no longer enough. Just as Yasemin mentioned in the presentation, this concept that simply getting to neutral will satisfy the world's requirements is not going to be what it takes. And so we have to radically rethink that diagram and really reach out to all of the tools that we've developed over the past 10 or 20 years and push them even harder. And so I think that as a means to creating energy efficient buildings, we have to holistically consider the embodied energy across the entire life cycle of buildings. And now that's starting to happen. And once we begin to understand where we're at, we can then figure out what piece of technology is right for this specific project to deploy and further push that concept of actually going carbon negative.
And Chris, before we jump into well said, Aaron, and before we jump into question, I also want to clarify something here. I don't think so. What we're showing today, I don't think we're suggesting that we should not continue to reduce. Instead, what we're saying is that yes, let's be very, very cautious about our emissions and reduce as much as we can by, again, building optimization, structural optimization, material optimizations. All of these things need to continue, and then use the sequestering technologies to actually go to positive. Yep. So we're not suggesting let's do business as usual and then add a few carbon capture and technologies on it to go to zero. That's not what we're proposing here. That reduction must continue, and these are supplementary measures to go for further carbon absorption from the atmosphere.
Yeah, we share that entirely, that hierarchy. Eliminate emissions, adapt to inevitable change, and removal in that order, but they're all necessary at this point. Yeah. So that's we're with you on that for sure.
Well, we had this light bulb that went off for the design team when we realized, and we really appreciate the carbon primer. It's become kind of a Bible for us, and oftentimes we have to look towards the problems first. And as we realized that the built environment is such a substantial draw on the global carbon debt, we have to turn that into the solution. And what we realized from the carbon primer is that buildings are barely mentioned. And so now we have to take all of these different elements and bring them together into the built environment. And that is architecture and urbanism at its best.
Absolutely. Great. Well, I'm going to shift over to Megha because I see we have a ton of great questions here. Megha?
Hey, yes, we do have a lot of questions. I'm going to start with one which we got, I think, a few times, and I know it's one you guys were thinking about. So some people asked, can Urban Sequoia's method be used to convert existing urban heat islands and buildings into carbon sinks, or are you focusing more on newer buildings?
I think these solutions that we looked at should apply to all building types and all building. I don't think we're making a distinction between new or existing. And we believe that that's the beauty of the urban environment, right? When we talk about built environment, there's a variety of scales, there's a variety of ages, and there's a variety of implementations that we can apply in each scale, and depending on the program use type of it too. So we try to take I think we do have some projects that are achieving net zero actually in existing buildings. And others have explored similar avenues. So we wanted to set ourselves a bigger challenge Hence, we took a new build where we will have to deal with the embodied carbon as well as operational carbon. So we don't have an existing structure to start with. So we were trying to set ourselves a tougher challenge. Hence, we chose a new building, but not to say that many of the strategies described today could be considered for existing buildings and beyond as well.
Okay, yeah, great. Another question we got was just on the materials. So are these materials you're talking about, the biomaterials, largely commercialized, or are they kind of in a, more of a testing phase?
I think some biogenic materials are already in use, such as, timber, bamboo, and various versions of those things, hempcrete. These are already being used at different scales. Other materials such as biobrick, I mentioned that we're actually developing actively that with University of Colorado and Primitive Materials. And some of the bioplastics, for example, that's already in development. I don't think it's we cannot go to Home Depot and buy them today. But I know that there is demand, and hence the questions also today. So I think there's big demand on this type of research and implementation of some of these. So we are seeing, I think it's moving quite quickly, and I suspect they'll be available at mass scale. There is a broader range of biogenic and sequester materials available going forward. Maybe not right now today, but fairly soon, I think.
Okay, yeah. Yeah, I mean, another question we had on the material side was, are you thinking about kind of adding things like biochar or biocarbons to the concrete? I know that's something that comes up a lot when it comes to concrete in these types of projects.
We weren't looking at maybe the existing technologies with concrete today, and we know that there's carbon cure, there's biochar, there's glass pozzolans, and other technologies. The focus for this exercise was not that, as we wanted to explore maybe the newer type of materials. The person asking the question knows this well, I think that, and thank you for the question. These are definitely technologies, materials that we should consider in everyday projects to reduce that embodied carbon as much as we can. And they're becoming more and more common as well in the built environment, which is quite optimistic. So we love hearing about those too.
Okay, great. We also had a question about just how the biomaterials compare structurally to more traditional materials. And specifically, are there some smaller scale demonstrations that you can use to kind of get contractors and engineers comfortable with their structural use for larger buildings?
Yeah, I will not want to talk to the structural properties, given I'm not a structural engineer, but I think there are, including ourselves, we actually are looking at a smaller scale. Of course, it's easier. We are looking at furniture pieces, we're looking at screens and walls, we're looking at pavilions with the use of this type of materials. And I know that others are as well. So there's some research, and CLF also, Carbon Leadership Forum, has a great paper actually on some of these systems. So that's a good resource for people who might want to learn more about them. So I think again, it's moving quickly, and there's more and more data available on these things every day going forward.
Okay. Another question we had was just about generally barriers to implementation. So, is it convincing building managers? Is it getting permitting, materials, things like that? What are kind of the biggest issues you're starting to see?
It takes so many to build a building generally, and this is no different. We get this question a lot actually, and I think you can imagine that in the scale that we do things usually, it's often many things have to be right. We need clients, we need investors, we need policies, we need approvals, we need architects and great engineers, and we need the right types of materials. So I think all of these things have to move in one direction. I think many of it, we are seeing it too. And I'm sure today on this call, we have a variety of professionals. I'm assuming we're not all architects and engineers, but many from different industries. And many of us here, I know with Open Air, for example, are involved in policy changes. So all of these things are moving, are starting to change, and it's going to have to be a collective effort from all of us.
Yeah. And if I could pile on, one of the big barrier to entries, I think, is just a general awareness of how important this topic is within our building industry. And as, contemporary architecture theory starts to evolve, leading the design of our buildings through this lens becomes so critical, and having clients and our contractors and the financiers behind this from the beginning is what's critical to really push this type of thing forward.
Yeah, makes sense. And kind of similar to that, I guess, someone asked, is it really critical to start establishing these types of buildings all in one area? I know you talked about kind of having a network within a city and then expanding to other cities. So why do you think about it in terms of like a city by city kind of basis instead of, just buildings wherever you can have them?
I mean, we were imagining, and again, I'm not sure if there's a right answer to this question, but I think it's a very good question. I think we were imagining that it's a network of new and existing buildings, and hence the strength of it too. I don't know if I think, for example, let's take the PVs as an example, right? It's kind of a dispersed, decentralized solution that exists in multiple integers, which are the buildings, multiple locations. And we were imagining that some of these technologies we explored here could adopt a similar strategy of this dispersed, decentralized solutions. Yeah. But we were focusing on urban environment just because of the density of it, because of maybe the compact nature of it, which could help.
Yeah. And it's also so fundamentally important to be considering, the built environment in terms of this connected ecosystem, and how one building that does this is not really going to push the needle. But if we can create a framework or a way of engaging with an idea, others can start to pile into this and actually enable that ecosystem to form and kind of thrive. And so if cities do this differently, it all adds up to this larger reduction of carbon within the atmosphere.
Yeah, absolutely. We also got a question on just general energy demand in the building. So have you looked into methods of reducing the energy demand of the building, such as passive radiative cooling or using the algae pikes as a heat exchange fluid, or anything similar on those lines?
I mean, we actually actively look at those type of things in our day-to-day life here. So, the radiant systems, more water-based systems, or more passive systems, more natural ventilation. And especially with COVID, we're also seeing, and there's an increased awareness of it too. And I think that's something that we do in even day-to-day project, not just in Urban Sequoia, but, we try to reduce operational carbon as much as possible with this type of intelligent building systems. And as Aaron was saying, is this ecosystem, right? The systems need to talk together. And actually the smart systems are really complementing that very well too. So we can gain even further efficiencies today, not just by active systems, but building energy and AI and user preferences into that too. So that's a growing implementation in the industry.
And as we integrate all of these systems in a more holistic way in our tall buildings, what we're finding through some of the built projects that we've seen is that this creates not only just a more advanced technological solution, but it can create a new type of kind of living experience that's more focused around health and wellness. And so that is, adding value into our projects through the design of and kind of integration of sustainability. And so this is all kind of part of that same conversation.
Yeah, absolutely. We had a couple of questions on sort of the financing side, which I'm going to read now. So the first one is, global development corporations investing in New York City are building a glut of luxury structures. They're working on incentives of an old system focused on profit. I'm curious as to hear some of the ways that you imagine incentivizing this type of development. And maybe as part of that, you could also talk about sort of the relative price of, these materials and approach that you're proposing versus a more traditional way of building.
I'm not sure if I feel equipped to talk about the global incentives that we can provide, but I think this is a very interesting question, and I think there was a lot of data that came out around the COP26 actually on this, and how the governments were upping the investments they have and incentivizing in different ways, and I think they're all taking a slightly different approach, which makes sense based on location, culture, and specifics of their society. But at the same time, we also noted that this past year, the investment on green structures, infrastructures, and systems has reached its peak. And it's multiple folds of where it was 3-4 years ago. And this is a trend that the investors are imagining it will continue on. So there's a great amount of investment coming in. And we also know that there's specific funds that are formed to only invest in green investments. So, and those also have certain rules on what type of, where this money can go, for example. And then we're also seeing from government side, there's, R&D efforts, tax incentives in different locations globally. And this is extremely important to achieve the 2040, 2050, 2060, and 2070 that goals that different governments have placed for themselves. So I think we're all working towards similar goals in different ways. So we're seeing more and more of it too.
Yeah, I mean, that's a great segue into the last question I have before I hand back to Chris, which is what kind of government policies and actions do you think would have the biggest impact in accelerating the deployment of these awesome ideas that you guys have?
Yeah, I think it's there are a couple of folds here. One is increasing awareness, I think, is key. And the second one is the creating a market demand. And we know that certain government policies and incentives, I guess it's the policies and incentives go hand in hand here. On carbon focusing incentives goes a long way, both in terms of research, but also creating the market demand to provide that research and advancement and the cost reduction and availability. So all these things that we're talking about today. Things like a carbon-free infrastructure, electrification bills we are seeing, policies like LECLA, similar policies on embodied carbon we are seeing on the West Coast. So I think all of these things, we're actually already starting to see them. And in the next 5 years, I'm positive that we're gonna see more and more progressive version. And we're all learning from each other on this too. So quite an optimistic scenario. I mean, I don't want to portray a rosy picture here, but also maybe to end with, this is maybe the closest we've ever been to solving this issue. And yes, we are still far, and it's still a challenge, a huge challenge of our times. Yet the awareness is at best it's been. Investments are coming in at a rate that hasn't been before. Policies are being augmented and implemented every day. So there's something positive happening, and yes, yet it still has a long way to go. But we have to be optimistic and keep on pushing in our own circles.
Great, thanks, guys. This has been amazing for the presentation and for all the answering all these questions. This has been great.
Thank you for having us.
Yeah, absolutely. It's been a pleasure.
Wonderful.
Yeah.
Just going to hand back to Chris to finish this up and talk about the next few weeks.
Great. Thanks, Megha. And again, Yasemin and Aaron, thank you so much. It's been such a pleasure watching this project evolve, and we'll look forward to following its real world implementations.